Hello, everyone. This is Nick Zatuni, Head of Operations from Coded Minds Canada.
And this is Ronar Qureshi, the iSteam Integration Specialist at Coded Minds. So, Nick, today we have a guest with us. Can you introduce him, please?
Mr. David Peachman. Would you mind saying hello to our listeners?
Hello, everyone. Really happy to be here and be a part of the show.
Alrighty, for you guys who don't know, of course, no one knows unless they checked our website. David is our social media specialist who actually had a very, very unique perspective in education, or even experience in education back in the day when he was doing high school. Thus, the theme of our 15th episode of Coded Talks, the perspectives of a person who was homeschooled. And to start with that, let me ask you one very simple thing, Dave. Why your family or you even decided to go for the homeschooling rather than a regular school?
Well, I mean, there were a bunch of different reasons, a few different reasons. The big catalyst was my older brother. When he was in school, he was out at recess, and he took the first 2 grades, I believe, in public school. And so he's out at recess, just playing in the backyard, and he picked up the stick and was just pretending it was a gun, and he was like a soldier or something, right? And then the teacher called my mom and recommended he get put on, I forget which drugs, but some like medication to not have this aggressive behavior. And so that was the first big thing where mom was like, I don't know about that. So then that was a big catalyst to choosing homeschooling, but it was also just to have more control over the curriculum, what we can get taught, and then removing any negative influences.
Sounds good. That is a very interesting perspective. I never thought that something like that could really end up being the catalyst for such a big change. So, having been homeschooled, what would you say your experience was like?
Well, it was fantastic. I wouldn't trade anything of it for the world. It was really, really great. And it was definitely, it was a lot different than what most people experience, for sure. When I was 12, 13, I was on a local Pee Wee football team in my local town. And so I was the only homeschooler kid on that team. And so everybody, it was almost like a zoo of sorts, where everybody was like poking and prodding me, like, wow, you're so normal though. How does that work? And it was, like even just chatting with them, they're used to, being in school for 8 hours or whatever. And whereas for me, it was only just a few hours, without having to shift between class and class, and getting the full attention of my parents when I was doing school. I'd just start my day at like 9 or something, bring out my big stack of books and just go through one after another, and then be done a little after lunch. And I mean, keep in mind, it does vary from homeschooler to homeschool. Everybody has their own way of doing things, but that's how I grew up doing it. So it was definitely a different experience for sure, but it was really great just in how much customization we had and what we could do, what we could learn. And just a lot of flexibility. For example, middle of the week, say we want to go to an amusement park or something, we could just get to go, or say we want to go on a field trip somewhere. We don't have to like plan it out for weeks or anything, get permission from anything. We would just pile in the car and head on out. So it was really great. And then, like I said, with the customization, we also really got to learn a lot that wouldn't necessarily be part of the regular curriculum. So, for example, one year I really wanted to learn about the science behind birds. So we got a book about that and went through it, did experiments on flights and bird watching and all sorts of stuff. So, if we wanted to learn something, we could just go and do it. Naturally, though, we still did follow the, math, science, and the general curriculum, but it allowed for a lot more flexibility in adding things and taking some stuff out that we didn't feel were necessary.
It's very impressive. And you know what? Again, it's a society problem, right? Like if you put 2 or more people into one specific location, you're gonna have that problem. It's just like that. You're gonna have different perspectives, right? And those perspectives, when they are synchronizing, they're good because then we can do great things. But when they go against each other, then when you start having issues. And just to go back to your point again, if your brother's teacher wouldn't have that interesting idea, to say the least, that grabbing a piece of wood and pretending that is a gun, like it puts me into questioning, as most parents might out there. So like, are the teachers really prepared? And to be honest, most teachers don't even have that psychological knowledge to make a call so hard that would push a child, or even a family in your case, to that corner where, like, why is this wrong, right? Which again, but that happens because you put so many different people, which is the school model, right, in one location, and you give some of them power, teachers and all the administrators and whatnot, and a lot of people without power, students, who basically will have to follow whatever it's out there, right? And just for the listeners to, I'm just saying that for the listeners to think about it and not questioning anything, because for me, it doesn't matter what type of system you have in place, there's going to be pros and cons. And we're going to be actually talk about a few of those in here. But my main point before I start going all over this, and I want your guys' take on, is school serves a purpose. And the purpose is to make sure that all the students, they get out of school with that minimum amount of knowledge that will allow them to succeed in the world. But funny enough, Dave here seems to be the odd number, because he went homeschooling, and I'm pretty sure you, Dave, learned much more than students that just go to school, and you still have the right tools to succeed in life. So what do you guys think about that conundrum that I'm just proposing here?
All right. So yeah, so that's a very good point that you bring up there. Oftentimes it's very, very concrete, in like when you discuss school, it's very curriculum based, right? You go through grades, you go through courses, and you are expected to come out at the end with a certain skill set and a certain set of knowledge, right? So what's interesting to hear with you, David, was when you talked about your interest in birds, right? You were able to get your parents to tailor what they were teaching you to the interests that you had at the time. And that's a much more personalized form of education that I feel a lot of the traditional forms of schooling really lacks in, right? And that's not something that can be changed very easily in the traditional form of schooling, just based on how it's set up, right? But it is definitely a big advantage of being homeschooled, and something that a lot of kids really miss out on is that opportunity to kind of express themselves and learn what they want to learn about, rather than just checking off certain boxes that the government deems necessary. So yeah.
Yeah, that is a tricky thing for sure. Like you said, Nick, you want your schooling to prepare you for life, to prepare you to succeed in your future jobs and career. And a standardized school system it can be tricky to be able to adapt and help everybody in that regard. And it can be tricky to decide, well, which one of these would prepare you the best? Is this route the better way to prepare kids? Is this route the better way? And that can be tricky. And I think the school system has done a pretty darn good job of that. But it can still, it does lack a bit of flexibility and adaptability that I think they can definitely improve on, to allow kids to be able to follow their interests a bit more and prepare more for the careers they want to be in.
And just to add a little bit of my foreigner experience here, as from back home, right? I agree with you, Dave. The schools here, they do a pretty good job trying to create a little bit of wiggle room, right? Back home, again, doesn't matter if you're private, doesn't matter if you're public, the schools will have to follow the curriculum. Everything extra doesn't give any edge to the students. We don't have schools with a credit system. And if you do, again, it's more for your personal learning than for you to be prepared for your future. You know what I mean? Most of the school system in Brazil is focused on a university admission exam that happens after 12th grade. So your whole school life is focused in learning as much as you can to be good on that exam so you can go to university. So that's why there is no wiggle room there. While here, especially when you hit high school, you have that possibility of credits. You have the possibility of pursue something that kind of might interest you in that very broad area, right? But even though there is that flexibility in those broad areas, each child's or teenager for that matter, specific interest might not be reached, right? So for you, Ronar, since we're going back and forth with different experiences here, had you had any experience like that where school was unable to do what you want or to teach you what you want, and then you just find a way to go around it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really allows students like within that traditional schooling system to kind of get at what they really like in life is clubs, right? That is the outlet where students can really go and express themselves for who they are. And I was very fortunate to go to a school that had over 100 clubs easily. And there was, if you had an interest, if you had a passion for something, I can bet you there was a club for it. So there was always something to keep everyone entertained, right? And keep everyone kind of engaged in the learning process because they had that club or way to kind of express their own interests to look forward to at the end of the day or at lunch, right? So that was one of the main ways that students could pursue their interest. Another I would say, less focused way was option credits. You had to have a certain amount of credits in option classes so you could graduate. And that allowed you to choose between around 20 classes that were more focused on certain life skills rather than the traditional curriculum. So you had foods classes, you had technology classes if you wanted, you had some story writing classes, right? And they were much more focused and shorter in nature, but they didn't have that strict curriculum. It was more the students kind of exploring their ideas and passions in a larger area, right? So if it was technology, you could touch on a lot of different things like robotics or coding or AI, right? So that was another way that the schools kind of encouraged students to kind of explore their interests a bit more. So yeah.
It's pretty good, pretty good. Now, since we touched base a little bit of the pros and cons here, that's what I want to hear from you, Dave, and even you, Ronar, if you want to, interact in this. For you, Dave, being homeschooled, what are the most notorious pros and cons of that educational style?
Mhm. Well, I guess like some of the top pros is that flexibility you get to have. You get to learn different things. You're not constrained to you have to be at this classroom in a specific time. You have to learn this specific subject. It's a lot more flexible. You can do a lot more varied things. And also having, I think, that one-on-one learning with your parent can also really help you understand concepts and subjects a lot better versus a teacher trying to teach a subject to 20 plus kids in one classroom. It divides their attention a lot, and they can't give each kid the specific care they might need. Like for example, I grew up with three older brothers, and each of us had different strengths and different weaknesses. So with something like math, my mom might have to spend extra time with one of my brothers who's a little weaker on that, or history or something, and they'd be able to get the time and care they need to be able to fully understand the subject. Whereas, like I said, within school, it can sometimes you can't always get that full care and get tons of attention if you are struggling with that. Naturally there's still resources and there's aids and all that sort of thing, but it's not quite as personalized and it's not quite as intimate, for lack of a better term, the whole learning process. So that's one of the bigger pros. And then I think that could be one of the large reasons why this is just on average. It's not not everybody for sure, but on average, on standardized tests, homeschoolers score higher than public schoolers. And I think a large part of that is because you can take that extra time to really learn a subject. And at least with my parents, they had very high standards for how much we had to know on a subject before we could pass. In order to pass a test or an assignment or anything, we'd have to get a minimum 80%. So it was always, if we got under that, then it's like, okay, we'll relearn, figure out what you got wrong, learn how to do it, better, how to improve on it, how to do it right, get the right answer, that sort of thing, and try to get better and get that higher mark. So then you fully understand the concepts and you're not just drifting through or anything. But then for a con, one of the classic cons is, you're home alone, you're with your brothers or whatever, you don't get social interactions, you don't get to meet people, you're a weirdo, that's the classic one that I always hear. And every single time without fail I ever tell anybody I was homeschooled, one of their first reactions is usually, oh, you're so normal, like, expecting some kind of freak or something. And I will say there is a bit of truth to it, in that in my experience, I've met a lot of homeschoolers over the years, and in my experience, there's two types of homeschoolers. There's the first type, which is the classic, my mom's my best friend, and like they don't get to, they don't really meet too many people, they don't hang out with too many friends. And again, this is purely my perspective, my small bubble of the world. They're usually in the minority. So the majority of homeschoolers are very socially active and do strive to make friends. But the difference is it does take more effort to make friends. You have to go out to make friends, because you can't just, talk to somebody next to your locker or the person you're sitting next to in class or in lunchroom or whatever. You have to go out and find those friends. You have to go out and make those friends. So it requires more effort, but it is doable to get that social experience and that social interaction. And also too, this isn't for everywhere, but where we live here in Alberta, it has one of the largest homeschool populations in the country. And so there's a lot of homeschoolers around and a lot of homeschool groups. So for example, in the county I live in, Mountain View County, there's a Mountain View Homeschool Association. And they put on like a lot of events, like, potlucks and dances and weekly gym class or skating, a whole bunch of things where homeschoolers can come and make new friends, meet people, and just have social interaction and kind of get that social interaction that can often be missing with homeschooling.
Yeah, so you touch a very interesting point there, Dave, and I know that for a fact because I research a lot about homeschooling, and there is advantages, as anything else in the world can have, but there are resources out there to fight those disadvantages, or at least to counter them in a way that, because again, I don't want to judge any system here. They all have their pros and cons, but the big idea that I always see is, if you are going to a regular school, is you're going to interact with people. A lot of interactions will be negative, but that is part of your growth. That is part of your learning. That's part of you becoming the future version of you, right? Some of them could be a little too traumatizing, that you might be shaped into a person that doesn't have all the skills that a person should have, or it's going to go the other way around too, right? You can just toughen up and learn a lot of skills that will actually be beneficial to you in terms of you finding your place in the world. And homeschooling, the same thing. If you just do the minimum homeschooling, staying at home with your parents, you're going to be sheltered. But if you start using those resources, then you're going to not only be able to fight all the disadvantages of it, but also to be exposed to a similar situation as a regular high schooler, traditional schooler would have. Right? Am I going too far here, or does it make sense?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like anything in life, you get out what you put into it, right? If you just coast through and do the bare minimum, you're going to get the bare minimum, right? But if you do take the time to make the schooling experience impactful and important and very conducive for learning, then the student, whether it's public schooled or homeschooled, is going to walk out being impacted and having learned a ton and being prepped for the world, right?
That is true. That is very true.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, that those are all great points that you bring up. My question for you is, you brought up a lot of that dynamic between the child and the parent, right? So the parent is not only your teacher, but they're also fulfilling all the other roles in your life, right? So how did you kind of differentiate between when it was your teacher and when they were your parent, right? Because that can, in my mind, that can be fairly tough, right? To kind of switch your mind to, oh, they're no longer my parent, they're now my teacher. So did you have that divide, or was it more of a kind of like a mixed dynamic throughout? How was that for you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've never actually thought about that, because for me, it would never be like, oh, she's a teacher now. It's like, oh, it's my mom just teaching me something else. Like, your parents throughout your life are teaching you, constantly teaching you things like skills, ways to live, opinions, beliefs, and all that. So when it came to homeschooling, learning math was just an extension of that, or learning, history was just an extension of that. I didn't have to, when I sat down to do school, I didn't think, okay, this isn't my mom anymore as the teacher. It's all I'd ever known, because I'd never known what a teacher was, right? So for me, it was just, oh, it's my mom just teaching me a subject. It wasn't, oh, this is a whole different person, she's putting on a different hat. It was just, no, it was just my mom teaching me a subject. And she'd teach me a concept or something, or I'd learn something and I'd be doing my homework and she'd just go bake bread or help somebody else, or whatever. She's doing mom things. So for me, I never felt like I had to switch, and I never considered, I never thought about her in two separate roles. It was always just one role, that being my mother slash educator. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Which
for
I
sure.
imagine is probably a lot different for you, Ronar, where those are very distinctive roles, your parents versus your teacher. Imagine that would be probably quite a lot different.
Yeah, yeah, no. Just bringing up that point, I think that makes a lot of sense, because since you didn't have that experience of having like a teacher being separate from your parents, that's all you, like you said, that's all you'd ever known. So that makes sense why it would be kind of like an everyday normal thing, right? Whereas I would bring up the example of the pandemic, right? A lot of students were basically they got that experience of being homeschooled to an extent during the pandemic, right? Especially those kids that were on hub learning, right? Because that was much more of a self-directed approach, where you had a very short class from a teacher every day, but then you had a whole bunch of assignments and notes and everything that you had to do on your own. So I didn't go through that, but my brother did, right? So he was essentially homeschooled during that last year, right? Where my parents or me would take on that role of teacher and walk him through those assignments if he was struggling, right? So that was something I saw him really struggle with, because he would, especially when I was teaching him, it was, oh, it's my brother, right? I can start talking about, who knows, Minecraft or something in the middle of it. But it was very hard for him to stay focused, because I was usually just his brother, not a teacher for him. And now I had taken on that additional role, or my mom had taken on that additional role, right? So he really had to almost think of us as separate people. And that's what we kind of told him to do, so that he would stay focused. Otherwise, his mind would, wander to other places, because he had only known having separate teachers and parents, right? So that was something interesting to see.
Fair enough. Yep. Now, I just thought of something here. I want to run by you, Dave. Because for me, as a teacher in my whole life, and again, I only taught high school and some private lessons back in the day, but and most of them were private institutions, right? So every time I was stepping into the teacher's role, I had to follow the curriculum, of course, as all teachers do, but I was always concerned with what we call nowadays of significant learning, right? So I know that I have a lot of content to give to my students, right? And in theory, just so I can check the curriculum box, I need to go over everything. But I understand, even because I was a student, that just because someone is teaching, it doesn't mean that the students are learning, right? So my idea was, what are the tools, what are the strategies that I will use as a teacher to bring that significant learning into what I'm teaching? And I use a lot of tools, right? As any teacher can nowadays, which is PowerPoints and animations and videos and whatnot. And they seem to have a good result in the end, right? Students would come to me and say like, yeah, I don't recall all the, the stuff that was in the book, but those two, three things that you mentioned and you use good images, those are good. Those I still remember, right? So I feel that overall, just because the school has this curriculum, those things that the students didn't choose, they tend to get bumped down in the significant learning. The student is forced to learn that. You know what I mean? But if you go to a homeschooling model, you need to follow the curriculum to some extent, as you know, as you explained. But just because you're learning what you want to learn, the learning becomes more significant. It becomes an easier part of who you are. It's even easier to memorize. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I'd fully agree. Like if you're interested in learning something, then you're going to want to learn it and you're going to put all your effort into it. And my parents always tried to make learning as fun, as interesting as possible. And they'd use a lot of extra resources, and they wouldn't make PowerPoints or anything, but they would use videos or try to make fun science experiments for us to do. And there's a lot of resources too for homeschooling these days. There's a lot of books designed for homeschooling. There's video courses and that sort of thing. And even some computer games teach subjects. So, we do a lot of that to try and ingrain the information and ingrain what we're learning, and to make it more fun and enjoyable. And then also, my parents would make games out of learning, like my friends would do that too. Where I remember I went to a friend's house once who was also homeschooled, and to help with math and finances and stuff, their parents, this is when they're little kids, their parents would put price stickers on various objects in the kitchen. So like, oh, this banana is $1, this banana is $2. And they had like a little toy cash register, and they'd have to ring it up and add the prices together, and then they'd go through scenarios of like, well, if I gave you a 20 for these, then how much do I get back? And that sort of thing. So stuff that makes it a little more fun, a little more interesting, and not just words on a page, but something a lot more tactile, something you can actually touch and work with and work through. And so having all of those resources really contributed to having a desire for me to learn, like for me and my brothers to really want to learn, to want to get better at these subjects, and just to grow as much as possible.
And as you wrote in one of our blog posts there, how many books you were able to read in a year?
I'm currently about a quarter of the way through my fourth year, reading 52 books a year.
52. So like, I consider myself a person who loves to read, but I don't get over 5 books a year. I'm a slow reader. I'll give you that. But again, it's not only that, because there's so many distractors that the pursuit of knowledge tends to get in the way. But if you get into that mindset, right, where, oh, I like this, I need to get better at this, that homeschooling can bring to you, again, there's benefit, right? There's value in it, a value that most people out there might not even see. And I am one of them, because I am a slow reader who can only read 5 books in a year.
Exactly. And like I said earlier too, like it does, you do get out what you put into it. Like even reading that much was a bit of a chore at first. Like I first started that little over 3 years ago. I thought, oh, I'm going to read 52 books a year. It was a challenge at first, like to actually sit down and read, because I'd never ever sat down to read for more than like half an hour or something like that. So I had to develop a bit of a muscle for it, where the more I did it, the easier and easier it would get, much like anything. But so even approaching learning or growth, at least in my experience, is kind of the same, where it takes a bit to develop that muscle, where it becomes easier and easier, where it doesn't take much effort, and you develop healthy and good habits that make it easier to learn and grow and acquire new skills and knowledge.
Mhm. There you go. All right. So let's think about this situation here now. Okay, I'm going to give you guys an example, and then Ronar gives me his perspective on it, and then you come and do the same thing. Okay, Dave? Let's imagine that we have that situation where we have two parents. Okay, a parent who wants to go and do all the homeschooling idea, and the other parent who will actually come and say, you know what, I want to do the traditional school. So let's have a little bit of a conversation here. Like, how would you to imagine that conversation to go, just so we can give a little bit of a perspective and even more value to the listeners here to increase their perspective of what homeschooling and the traditional schooling can be. So let's start with Ronar. Ronar, how would you help those parents?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognize is that there's no one right answer with this, right? As we discussed, there's pros and cons to both methods of schooling, right? Personally, having gone through a very traditional form of schooling and then somewhat having encountered learning from home because of the pandemic, I would say that I did slightly prefer having that flexibility where I could kind of choose when I was doing certain tasks, right? Where I could kind of reorder what I was doing based on priority or what I was feeling, right? Where I could look into new things that interested me more than the traditional curriculum. I might actually suggest that if parents are willing to take that time and they can recognize that this will take a lot more effort from their part, I would actually suggest the homeschooling route, because I would say, and again, this is dependent on the child and how motivated they are and how they learn, whether they can learn at a home setting or whether they learn better with peers. There was definitely advantages of having that experience of learning at home. So obviously they would have to supplement that with other methods of social interaction and everything to make sure that the child, as David mentioned, doesn't grow up having their mom as their best friend and no other friends and whatnot. But yeah, no, it was an interesting experience, and I can't wait to hear what David has to say about this.
Yeah, well, funny enough, I'd have to agree a lot with you. It will naturally depend on how the student learns and how much time the parents have, because typical homeschooling does require a lot of time. Like if both parents are working, it's a lot harder to be able to teach your kid on the side as well. It's a big time commitment, and in order for a homeschool kid to be able to learn well, they do need that time from their parents. You can't just teach them things for 10 minutes and leave for the day. You do need to help them work through issues, help them work through problems, help them figure out the solutions to those problems. And so yeah, it is a big it does take a lot of time, is what I'm saying. And then, like you also said, Ronar, it also takes effort to be able to have social interactions and for kids to get those social skills with other kids, peers. And so if you don't have that time and you can't have you're not able to put in the effort, it might be the better route to go towards the traditional public schooling, where you can drop the kid off and they're going to be cared for there. So it will very much depend on the parent, but I mean, I got my own bias towards this, but given the opportunity, I think homeschooling would be the better option for the child if you have the time, effort. And I will also say too, a lot of people that I've talked to feel a little scared too about the prospect of homeschooling. Like they might think like, oh, he's not going to be able to get into school or like into college, post-secondary, not going to make friends. And you can do all of those things. Like I went through my full degree. All of my brothers got degrees. One of my brothers got his master's. They all have careers going. It wasn't a stumbling block. It's, we had to be a bit creative at some points, but it wasn't a huge challenge and a huge issue to get into post-secondary and to continue our education. And even with jobs or careers, it wasn't a huge issue or deal to be able to work well with other people, make friends, have life skills. But it all, of course, depends on how much time and effort you can provide for the child.
And you mentioned a great thing there, Dave. I was about to ask you in regards to post-secondary, because again, after my reading and my research on the subject, there is that fear, right? Like, oh my God, my child's going to be so outside the system that my child might have a hard time going back into the system. And in my mind, in my perspective, with me and my neurons alone, it would not. Because let's be honest, there are a lot of high schoolers who go to college, university, that don't have the social skills that a person that was homeschooled might have. And then we go back and we connect the dots of, it really depends on how much time and effort the child, the parents will put into learning, for example, a social skill. And I want to quote my example here, that I was often bullied. I was often, shunned down by my friends in high school back home. And that was, quote unquote, the norm unless you're famous. And here I am, like I was able to go through everything else. So there is a lot that depends on the student rather than the system itself. Right. So that's good food for thought for all the parents and for this fight that like, oh, homeschooling is better. Oh, no, traditional schooling is better. Again, as we mentioned several times, they both have pros and cons. And I guess that's our take home message. At least I've been doing the podcast here for longer. And at one given point in the podcast, I'll always say it depends, pros and cons, because it's quite obvious, right? At least I like to make it quite obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think it's really important for the parents to do the research and figure out what works for them. Like for some parents and for some students, a public school education might be the better option to go with. It tends to be a little easier, but then for other people, homeschooling might be the way to go with. I just encourage people to do your research, learn about it, and know that if you do homeschool, you're not screwing your kid for life or anything. He will survive. He will do well if you put in the effort. And there are a lot of pros and cons to both, as you said, Nick.
Yep. And just so all the listeners here might be thinking, maybe homeschooling is the best way. And personally, I think there's a lot of the advantages, they easily trump the disadvantages, but homeschooling, it's not without any support. Here in Alberta, as David mentioned, there are associations, there are professionals who actually visit you in your homeschooling setting, checking how the progress of the child is going, or the teenager, right? Just to see if not only the child, teenager is following the curriculum, but also if what is being learned is actually, again, significantly learned, if it makes part of the learner, right? If it changes their life, if it changes their brain somehow. And if you are interested, the government does offer some subsidy. I am not quite sure how much, but it was not a big deal. But you need to go into the government website, you need to apply for it, you need to be assessed. And then hopefully, if you're going to get it, you have some money to spend on books, resources, and whatever. Because as we all know, homeschooling is not free, right, Dave?
Yeah, it is not. But like you said, though, that there is a subsidy, and I forget how much it is, and they change it. It's changed quite a bit since I was homeschooled. But like there's lots of support out there. My mom, in fact, is a homeschool facilitator, so she helps people homeschool and make sure they're on track with the curriculum and they're on track for learning and getting them their subsidy and all that. Like there are a lot of associations out there that will help you if you do need the support and you do need resources. They are there, and it's it's very doable. It's not as hard as one thinks. And if it's for you, I'd recommend going for it.
Perfect. My final take here is, again, I was traditional schooled. It made me suffer a lot through life with all the bullying and all like the peer pressure and whatnot. But with the right perspective, and my parents had a big role in this, of explaining, of making sure that I was aware of what's going on. I was able to understand and learn that whatever happened to me, it's more common than I would imagine. And there's a lot of students who suffer. And I was actually there for most of those students suffering because I knew the way. I knew how to transform that bad experience into something positive that made me, according to a lot of people out there, a good person. I hope they're right. But again, it all depends on the effort, as we already talked about, and in how much you as a person is going to learn. Which brings me to my final point. It's not because you're going to put your child into a regular traditional school that your child's going to become, like a bully, as a lot of people, if you're going to see a lot of news out there, will think, right? The industry is having a huge shift to a little bit more of homeschooling and less traditional schooling because of fear. Parents are scared that, oh my God, their children are going to be, socially destroyed if they go to traditional school. There's always a chance, but there's always a chance that if you don't teach your child right during homeschooling, that he will become best friends with the mom or the dad and have zero social skills in life. So for all the parents out there, if you are scared, as Dave said, seek information, make sure that's the right thing for you, because regardless of the system, it all takes a little bit of one mistake, one lack of focus in the right thing to have the same result in both methods, traditional or homeschooling. Any final thoughts, you two?
I think you bring up a good point there. I would say my message is basically, it's not cut and dry, right? It's very complex in the nature, because how a child ends up is very determined by external factors, right? So they can encounter those same external factors at home as they're encountering in a public school setting, right? So it really depends on how much commitment from both the child and the parent they're willing to put in, and as well as a bunch of other factors, right? What resources you have at home, what resources the child can access at home, right? How they're going to be interacting with other kids, even if they are homeschooled. So it's a whole pool of different things that you have to consider before you can make the choice and before you can get the wanted results from either method. And I think do your research is the best advice for parents. And really, if you can, maybe even try out both. See which one works better for both you and your child, and then make the decision on how you want to continue for the rest of the traditional K-12 schooling. So
I think you really hit it on the head there, Rona. It really try both. I knew I had friends that ended up doing the last few years of their high school in a public school, or I knew some people that started out in public school for first few grades and then decided to switch to homeschool, just because it fit them better. So if you have the opportunity, try both. And of course, do your research, learn as much as you can. There's lots of resources and support out there, lots of websites, and lots of people you can talk to that'll give you good perspectives on both sides. And good opportunities either way.
Perfect. Then I think that's a wrap. Ronar, David, thank you very much for enlightening our listeners with amazing knowledge, and more to come in the next episodes. This is Nick Satuni, over and out.
All right, this is Ronar Krejci signing off.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Appreciate it.